Hello and welcome back to the Reinventing Real Estate podcast. Today we had Joss Muirie, the founder and CEO of Abodus, with us talking all things PBSA.
And it was amazing that he identified the missing link between the operator in PBSA and the investor and what needs to fit between.
Yeah, and I loved how he really delved into the perfect recipe for leasing up buildings and really sharing that secret sauce of the percentages as well.
He also shared about the challenges and whether you should actually buy first and second generation refurb assets.
Yeah, I mean, Josh was so interesting because, needless to say, he'd had a bit of truth elixir before he came on here. So you're going to get all the honest opinions, the raw truths about what you should and shouldn't be doing to be successful in the PBSA sector.
This is a controversial one, so stay tuned and let us know how you get on listening to it. Joss, thank you very much for joining us on the Reinventing Real Estate podcast. We're very, very grateful to have you today.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, Joss, I think what's really interesting is just talking about the market. I mean, clearly you've been in the student housing market for quite some time, and you've seen the sector from the beginning. But what do you think it's got right and where has it gone wrong?
Well, I think the first statement to make is that I've probably gone wrong in the fact that I'm still here after 30 years involved in the sector. I can't think of anybody else with my length of expertise and experience in the sector who isn't retired and living on a yacht. So that's where I've gone wrong. I think fundamentally that's the start. I think what have we got right and what have we got wrong? I think the biggest thing we've got wrong, and particularly when we compare ourselves to Europe now, is we ended up in a race for amenities and specification in this country, the like of which is pretty crazy. When you talk about buildings with saunas in them and jacuzzis and cinema rooms get a variant amount of usage, but I think the race to sort of luxury and the type of luxury that's available in PBSA is slightly beyond the pale. I think if you look at what's been done in Europe over the years, things have been done in a much more sort of sensible way because as a result, it's costed more sensibly. Here, we've just been in an arms race for luxury, and I think it's got completely out of kilter with where we started. Fundamentally, it was all about ensuring that universities had enough accommodation for their first years, and because every university had an obligation. And so when Tony Blair came to power in the mid-1990s, his aspiration was to have 50% of all of 18 to 30-year-olds in higher education. And as a result, numbers grew tremendously in a very quick period of time and have continued to grow. And therefore, that cohort of first years that required accommodation, that's where PBSA grew up. It was in being able to provide that first year accommodation. It didn't matter if you were from overseas or from the domestic population, but fundamentally it was really about the domestic population. And I think in recent years we've become more and more obsessed, incorrectly, as far as I'm concerned, with the overseas market. The overseas market 30 years ago, 20 years ago, was very predominantly EU. Now, of course, it's changed dramatically and it's heavily China focused. And so I just think but still ultimately the proportion of overseas students to domestic students has remained relative from 20 years ago to where it is today. It's just there's been a shift in that overseas preponderance of nationality from being EU to wider in the world. And I think we've catered too much for that. And we've forgotten the core of where it was all started, which was domestic university students. And so we now talk about an affordability crisis. The affordability crisis that we're in is more fundamentally about the state of the nation. Sorry, I had to hold myself back from a profanity there. But ultimately, the state of the nation is purely a reflection, is now being reflected in the sort of affordability gap for students going to university. So, now we're sort of going, oh my God, we need to address it. We need to strip things back. We need to be more sensible. How can we build more sensibly? How can we, et cetera, et cetera. But, that's our own fault. If we'd stuck to what we were doing originally and we'd continued in that vein about providing mid-market accommodation that was suitable for everybody, we wouldn't be in a situation today. And ultimately, if that client group does not arrive in the UK, then those businesses get thumped. And there are businesses that have literally completely designed their entire business plan according to serving those groups of overseas students, which I think the rationale behind that is low as far as I'm concerned.
And I'm assuming you're talking about Chinese students.
I am fundamentally, and I just think in a world which we see today, certain things can happen in the Strait of Hormuz, and there's an immediate impact around the world. If certain things happen in the Straits of Taiwan, there could also be a huge reaction around the world. And I think fundamentally, one needs to be very careful about pandering to certain markets. I think there's no reason to either. I think, ultimately, I find it strange that we are doing that and we are creating buildings which appeal to the Chinese community and specifically, and creating a Chinese community, in isolation from the rest of the student population, because surely part of what they want is not only an element of British education, they want an element of British experience. And so I fail to see how, having a building that isn't integrated or a community that isn't integrated and reflective of the world that we live in today is a sensible idea.
And in terms of brand in student living and how important brand is, how do you think that has been misunderstood in the market?
I'm not a marketeer. I'm not an advertiser. I tend to have quite a good nose when it comes to bullshit, and I just think, unfortunately, I don't know. I get the brand is something that people sort of put a terribly large emphasis on sometimes. I just think, you want to actually go one step back and what does this brand stand for? Yeah. And I'm far more interested in what, when you talk about brand and branding, for me, certainly in my business, when people ask me what does Abodus stand for, what does the brand stand for me, it just, it's about service level. So that's what I focus on. When it comes to all the elements of brand marketing, the changing whims of our customer base are phenomenal, and they can change in a 5-year cycle. 1 minute you have a cohort of students who, well, for the best part of most of my existence anyway, have been sort of, when I started, it was like pub crawls and having a good time, and I think it involved alcohol. Now we live in a society where bubble tea and quiet nights in and silent discos are more fun than going out to a disco, or a club. So, I think you need to be very careful when you smack a brand, on something, because you need to be adaptable in our market. You need to be adaptable to each cohort that changes. Generation X to Y, etc., and Z. But yeah, that there's even a smaller. There are smaller year groups than that, as far as I'm concerned, that you see, where societal shifts are taking place, not in a 20-year shift, but there could be 4 shifts in a 20-year period. So I think putting too much of a brand around things is dangerous, and you need to constantly reevaluate what your brand means, unless, for me, it's picking one thing that will always remain constant, and that is service level. And it doesn't matter whether you're a student in a studio block in Bristol paying £350 or £400 a week, or a student in Newcastle on a nominations agreement paying £150 a week with Abodus. You will still get the same level of excellence at both ends of the scale, and the services that are behind that. And I think that to me is what's fundamentally important. So that becomes my definition of brand, really.
I love that point around actually so many bits of differentiation between the generations, because I think when you're at a conference, people talk about Gen Z or Gen Alpha as if they're totally homogenous. And actually, the age demographic is quite wide for a market where you've got social media that's evolving on a day-to-day basis, and you've got artificial intelligence, and, we don't know what's coming our way. So actually, as you say, in 2 years' time or 3 years' time, as those sort of ages start to evolve, they're all responding very differently to different trends. And so it's sort of constantly being adaptive while maintaining that service level and not compromising.
Absolutely, and that's why service level is my touch point, because it's the only thing that does remain the constant. I think back in my in the early days of my business, I wanted to actually start marketing on the basis of and we now do collect the data. So I think 10 years after I originally wanted to do it, we're probably going to get there. But I wanted to be able to say, because service levels are such, I wanted to be able to say, our average time for turning around a block loo or something within the business was 6 hours or something like that. That was the average time to create, a block of info, collect all the data over the passage of a year, and then literally be able to say, our average turnaround time for fixing this is 6 hours across the business. Because I think also it brings reality back to student expectations. Because sometimes they take for granted what our teams do and spend a lot of time doing. And they forget that, if they were at home at mum and dad's, it's probably 5 days to get a plumber to come around, and then they expect, well, hang on a second, I'm living in blah, blah, blah. I want my shower fixed, immediately, or the boiler mended immediately. Well, it's like, guys, we can probably get it done for you in 24 hours. Sorry, you're going to be without water. But in fact, in my own home as the CEO of this business, it would probably take me 3 or 4 days to get a plumber to come around. So let's just balance our expectations for a moment here. So I think, I always just thought it'd be great marketing material, because I'd love to see how that also compares to the whole hotel industry. Because actually, what we do in a lot of locations and where we have on-site teams, I think our turnaround times are probably up there with the 4-star hotel business, but people take it for granted or don't think about it at all. And it was brought home heavily to me actually during COVID, because I think what people forgot were, everyone's having a disaster, everyone's having a nightmare. But my staff stood up and they were on site every single day, and they were, to the detriment of their own families, because everybody else was, pretty much at home and working from home, etc., etc. They would come in, they would deliver those services, and everybody really kind of forgot them, and I found quite annoying, let's say, particularly when the staff. And don't get me wrong, you've got a cohort of young people who are being closed up and closeted in a way that they don't want to. So it's perfectly understandable. But when, they started sort of, occasionally there'd be the odd person who'd take something out on a member of staff, and it was like, boy, no, they've left their family to come and look after you guys, etc., etc. So I got quite vehement about that during during the COVID period. But also, it really did make me realise that we have something here that we don't really talk about. We don't really talk about the fact that the service level is absolutely key and fundamental to what we do. So yeah.
And I think that ties into a conversation that we've had quite frequently, which is investors' constant focus on OPEX. And the sort of focus of how do we shave down the OPEX at the expense of everything else in order to maximise NOI. But what's your views on that?
So fundamentally at the moment, what am I doing in my business? I am fundamentally shaving everything I can off OPEX. But I do so with the bent that we've always talked about, is that ultimately I think what a lot of people don't realise is, and don't necessarily think about, everyone's becomes obsessed about reducing OPEX. And it is an important thing to do, and particularly in the light of the fact that next year undoubtedly we're going to see utility costs go through the roof yet again. And so we have to find ways of mitigating the OPEX and more efficiencies in the way that we control OPEX, in the way that we source and procure OPEX, our OPEX lines, etc. We need to be as clever as we possibly can be. We need to be able to use, as many, energy self-generation scenarios as we possibly can on site. We need to look at conserving energy as much as we can, and we look at loads of different things. And I love a lot of the great ideas that come out of my asset management department, and I've got a business partner who's involved in another business as well, and he has some crazy ideas come across his desk on a lot of the time, and it's really quite inspiring. So anyone who's got any great ideas about how we can do that, we're very open to trying anything to deliver that. But as much as I think OPEX it is something that we should control better, I think if you really want to see NOI growth, it's a combination of managing your OPEX well, but also as part of that OPEX, I think a lot of people over the years have not understood that certain service levels need to be maintained, and not just maintained, constantly challenged. I mean, one of the big things in our business is we've been very lucky over the years, both domestically in the UK and even now abroad, to have won awards for our operations. But every time we do that, and my team expect a big pat on the back, as they rightly deserve, but my next reaction, almost immediate reaction, because I do have to remember to pat them on the back and say well done, but my almost immediate reaction is, great, what are we going to do next? Because I think we constantly need to challenge the status quo. And a lot of the part of where I see things is that it's about growing the top line. And you cannot grow the top line without providing something that is of quality to your students and your student recognises. When I negotiate with a university, first of all, there is a bare minimum of services that a university requires an operator to provide to be able to work with a university. And I think there's some investors out there who don't even get that. And a lot of that, for instance, they'd be, excuse me, they'd immediately say, oh, well, hang on, what's all this full-time night security? What are you doing? Why are we doing that? Well, actually, a lot of universities insist on that, and I don't think that's a bad thing to have either, quite frankly. Having full-time security, being able to sleep in my bed, knowing that my customers are safe in their beds, is a pretty important thing as far as I'm concerned. So, having night security is an important thing, and the universities are very keen on it. But a lot of people will desperately try and cut it, and then they ask, oh, well, why can't we get a university contract? Because you've cut the security, you muppets. I mean, it's as simple as that. So that's a big element that they don't realise. And that's what I would call a basic element. Mm. And I think, but it goes up from there. It's like, everyone wants to cut marketing budgets and reduce costs. And ultimately, for me, I got asked a question the other day by somebody who asked me, why did our marketing budget go up by, I think it was 46% across some of our assets from one year to the next year. And I was like, because our gross operating income went up 27%. So you can see a direct correlation between the 46% uplift in the marketing budget for the following year. And the following year resulted in a 27%
Wow.
increase in GOI. So, on exactly the same assets, and I think, and when you look at that 46% increase in marketing, that sounds a huge amount, doesn't it? But when actually you look at the sum and then what it actually delivered in terms of millions of increase in income, you're talking, across that specific portfolio, you're probably talking, I don't know, I'm guessing 100,000 increase in sales produced, let's say, 3.7 million increase in GOI. So yes, the 46% produced the 27%, but it's a material uplift. So I think there's a lot of naivety around what additional expenditure in be it marketing or the services areas of your OPEX can be then reflected in your GOI, your income for the following year. So I it's a mismatch that goes on. It will continue to go on, and there will always be lots of middle managers at PE houses and investors who go, oh, cut, and they think that's the natural way of doing things, and it's not. We've delivered over the years huge increases in income, and it's just by sensibly managing both the services, because the services provide you a justification, even to a university, of, guys, well, we've invested this over this last year into our life residences program. We need to see a return on that. Universities understand that. Over the years, our life residences program, we've had, I don't know, 4 or 5 universities approach us and just go, Joss, we really like your program. Could we have it? Well, no, that's our program.
IP, yeah.
But we'll help you. We'll help you to a certain extent develop yours for your assets, etc. But I think they see that value add, and actually, when you put it in those terms to them, they're very grateful that you do. And and if you can actually justify to a university, do you know what, I'm putting my rents up this year because that's what that's what you charged last year. I once had a situation in a city where a new guy had come in to run an estates department, and he was like, so, Joss, you seem to be wanting to put the rents up considerable amount. I'm like, yeah, because you're comparing your rents now, which were post-COVID, you've gone to 40 weeks a year as a policy. And so on a price per week, my rents look high compared to yours. I said, but you need to remember your predecessor, pre-COVID, he was letting up £42 a week. He was letting up 42 weeks. So actually, I think your buildings are under rented and you should be putting your rent up by X. He was delighted in telling me that he'd actually put a paper forward to the board based on my numbers that he could justify. And that year, the university put their own rents up by 11%. Because I demonstrated to them they were under renting their own assets, which in turn helped me put my rent up by 17%. So, the long and short of it was a kiff. It worked for the university, it worked for us, because I'd been able to explain logically why it was justified. And universities aren't there, to detract from people being commercial. They just want a justification for it.
What do you think the last leasing cycle, 2025-26, exposed about the market? Because I think a lot of investors felt with PBSA it was all about, build it and they will come. But what did 2025-26 sort of showcase or shine a light on, do you think?
I think the first thing it shone a light on was the difference between occupancy and economic occupancy. Because I think a lot of the occupancy that's been reported across the market is, let's say somebody says their building was 90% full. I've no doubt it was 90% full. Was it that 90% full reflective of the rents that they started the year at? No. So I think their economic occupancy was probably 80% if they're saying that their occupancy was at 90%. And I think that was prevalent across the market. I think that one person who has suffered the most but deserved the least and most amount of credit was actually Unite. And, I don't think they were far off on their occupancy. Yes, they've had a traditional occupancy level of 97% going back years. Did they miss that? Yes, but not by far. They also very sensibly, in advance of that year, because it doesn't just happen in that year, they secured additional nominations agreements. So their nominations agreements were going up. Everybody pointed to the fact that meant their direct letting went down. But I'm like, no, yes, of course it did. But ultimately, you've missed the point. Is they foresaw what was going to happen this year, and they increased their nominations accordingly as a defensive play. And I don't think, I didn't see Unite at the end of the cycle offering loads of offers like everybody else, including ourselves, was doing to achieve the ultimate occupancy. Now, did they dynamically rent up in the cycle like my business does? Not probably so much. So, they still took a hit, but I think they took a hell of a lot less hit than most people did. And I think they ended up taking a massive hit in their share price for just being what I would anticipate as being slightly off the numbers. I think they were one of the best performers across the sector last year. And I think their strategy going forward is superb. I also have to caveat to say here that I have started buying shares in Unite on behalf of my son, who I owed a lot of money to.
There's no bias in this conversation, Joss.
No, but actually, look, I think, there is, I think it's the best buy. I think everyone should be buying United shares. I think they're a good company, know what they're doing and going in the right direction. And I think they've seen the market a year before everybody else did. So quite frankly, I found it quite astounding that they got bashed, or their share price has been bashed quite as much as it has. So I think that was the first big thing out of it all. I think economic occupancy, and I think there's a theme that people have been talking about for a number of years, which is flight to quality. And look, I am a great believer in education. I mean, I'm weirdly in an industry where actually I believe in the wider element of what we're doing in a big way. Education is everything for me. So the more kids we can get into higher education, the better. Do all kids need to be going to university? Absolutely not. I mean, I think we made a massive mistake back in the 90s where we split the polytechnics and the university, or amalgamated the polytechnics and the universities. I think technical colleges, specialist institutions that teach trade skills are incredibly important. Now, universities can do that. And I think that, there are certain universities that are quite specialist in doing it. And I think we need to get back to that. We need to accept that not every university can be the centre of academic excellence, for the world. Places like, and I don't want you to pick out names roughly, but I happen to know that they have got some very good practical courses. The University of Wolverhampton, for instance, that should be somewhere where people literally, aspire to go, who want to get really good at very technical and trade scenarios with enhanced opportunities for jobs and employment directly. That's linked potentially between working and having a hybrid of work and education. I think that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
But but I think the flight to quality has been seen, particularly from the overseas markets. People are focusing more and more on the top 20 universities in the UK. And that's understandable. And I think that will always... Look, it's the whole thing about going to university and education is aspirational. If you're 135 in the list of universities in the UK, you really going to expect loads of people knocking on your door? I mean, come on. I think we have to be rational here. and there are too many universities, and I think the amalgamations, which we are beginning to see, it's going to be a bit like social housing associations. When a housing association fails, it doesn't disappear, it just gets amalgamated by another housing association. And that's what's going to happen with universities. They're not going to disappear. They're effectively going to amalgamate with another university, and that's going to be it. So I think this theme about the flight to quality is there and will continue. What else did 2000? I think the big thing, going back to your OPEX question earlier, Jamie, is I think the big thing that 25, 26 is exposed is there are so many investors out there who've come into the sector particularly in more recent years, the last 10 years, who have come in and, as you put it, ridden a wave. And they have paid no attention and no respect to asset management. Ultimately, they believe, inverted commas, that the third-party facilities managers out there are doing asset management. They're not, and it's unfair to try and pretend that they are. I recently had a CEO of one of the best and biggest of those companies saying to me, Joss, people keep asking us for asset management services, and we don't do that. We do facilities management. I'm like, I know. We're just there for operations. I was like, I know. It's kind of strange that there is this gap in expectation between investors and the operators, and I don't think anybody really. There are too few institutions and investors in the sector that have understood that gap, and some people try and deal with it in house, from the investor's point of view, and ultimately, you'll end up with somebody who's probably not very well versed in student accommodation. You suddenly get somebody who's been looking after sheds or offices for the last, it's like, tenants in there for 5 years, I don't really have to do anything. This is a totally different level of asset management. I remember years ago going to Aberdeen Asset Management, and I was like, well, who's going to do the asset management? And I remember the chap turning around to me and going, the clues in the name, Joss. Well, actually, I was like, so you're going to do this, and he's like, oh no, we don't have to do that with sheds. I'm like, no, you don't. But there is a level of asset management involved in an operational business such as ours, which is utterly crucial. And operational, let's be clear, the third party operational businesses do not have that expertise. And it ranges right from the ESG elements of your business through to the utter fundamentals of driving that P&L, but also your top line income. If sales teams within operational teams, you need poachers. You got poachers and you got gamekeepers, and you need the gamekeepers there. You need people to, all operators care about is ultimately achieving the occupancy on a building. They don't really care about, optimizing every single penny out of it. And there used to be an old adage a colleague of mine had from back in the day, and it was very back to the early days of PBSA, is you want to sell your last bed on the last day before university opens. And if you haven't done that, you haven't optimized your income. And, I've always stuck with that mantra. But I'll never forget a few years ago, I was touring a city with somebody who was managing 5 assets in that city for a large operator. And they turned around to me and said, with glee in their face, and they said, we were full before the end of December. And I turned to the person I was with and I was like, if he'd have been in my business, I'd have fired him. I mean, the last day, I don't want a building full until, look, I'd love buildings to be a lot fuller come August, but ideally, if it's full on the 1st of October, I'm a happy boy, because it means we've optimized our income for that year. But I think there are very few people that actually really understand that and and drive their businesses in that manner.
As you rightly say, that's something that's incredibly misunderstood in the sector in terms of, you know, that want to fill buildings as quickly as possible and seeing that as that kind of trophy or the light at the end of the tunnel. But actually, you're absolutely right. You know, in order for you to maximize the income, actually you want that to be, you know, consistent, and healthily consistent, but up until that final point.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, in an ideal situation, you fill 25% of your building with rebookers from the previous year. You then, I like working with universities. You get another 20%, 25% of your business from a university. Let's say we've got a big 600, 700 bed block, and you do that, and then you've got 50% of the building to go out there and directly market and let, and you can really, from there, you can really drive the income, because the other element is you've got confidence, you've got full confidence in 50% of your buildings let. 350 or 300 beds have gone, and you've only got to fill that other 300, 350 beds. And therefore, you can be more aggressive on pricing as long as you're sensitive to that aggression. I mean, ultimately, in the last couple of years in Leeds, dynamic renting, we've gone the other way. So we've started the year, we've got our rebookers in, then we've dropped prices, and then we've gradually built up. But each year, we've gradually built up back up to above where we were the year before, and then the cycle started again. And we filled our building in Leeds for the last 2 years. 100% occupancy, but has there been overall rental growth over those 2 years in that city? No. We've protected our occupancy, but we've also protected our pricing by going down and coming back up again each year. So it's been stagnant, but there'll be room to grow again in the future. But yeah, you've got the sensitivities, and this comes back to the asset management point. You've just got to be on it, and almost on a weekly basis, and then it goes from a weekly basis through the cycle to the end of the cycle where you've got to be on it on a daily basis. I mean, how many beds do you have left? How many days do you have left? How many do you need to sell a day? That is where I was at the end of last year, driving my teams. That's how we did better than a lot of other players in the market. It was daily targets. It was daily me on top of people, literally looking at every single asset and every single place. So,
I do think you hit the nail on the head when you talk about the asset management relationship with the operators, because the operators, as you say, will admit that they're there to do a certain role, and their role is to get some bookings in. But actually, the asset manager is looking at every single element of the entire development and entire project.
absolutely.
And that feeds into the broader portfolio or
Absolutely.
strategy. So there is so much emphasis on the asset manager now. And I think that's where a lot of these funds actually fall down, as you rightly say, because if you're just leaving everything to the operator, you're not creating the nuance or the small micro movements in the market that actually can generate those large upticks in NOI and GOI. Like you mentioned earlier about the marketing budget going up by 46%, but the GOI going up by 26, 27%. And that decision comes from the perspective of being confident in the investment that you're undertaking in order to drive the value that you need from the sale that might happen in 5 years' time.
Absolutely, the ROI on that is insane. And the asset management role literally goes from that ESG. So you've got the role effectively. It incorporates keeping your OPEX costs down. But looking year ahead on year, all the way through to that function and the ESG and all of those elements, which are could be 1 year hence, 2 years hence, whatever, but ultimately will benefit the portfolio in itself. But then to the micromanagement of ensuring you capture. You've got one chance to capture your GOI. Yes, it's one chance that's over effectively a period of call it 48 weeks. But, come the 1st of September or the 1st of October, that is your main year done. Now, we could go and talk about the growth in second semester lettings and back lettings and going through that process and, et cetera, et cetera. And that does seem in certain cities to be growing. But ultimately, your ideal scenario is to have one tenant in for the full year or for your full 44 weeks, and then you were just worrying about your summer business. But your asset manager needs to be involved in your summer business plan as well. So, all along, it's, you're going to get somebody who goes, oh yeah, we can put it out with so-and-so and, well, that'll be the summer business. But it's like, well, hang on a second. Well, the asset manager needs to do the piece of work which goes, well, hang on, where's the return on investment there? So we're going to be paying them to do this, but then it costs us this to keep the building running. Or, you've got 5 buildings in one location. Why don't we do that in one building? Why don't we let that building out? Why don't we mothball that building for the summer? And then actually you create a scenario which is far more efficient. You've got all the people going into one building. You've got reduced your costs, etc., etc. So somebody's got to do the maths and make sure it all stacks up on in the right way to be a profitable exercise for the summer. And that comes down to asset management. Again, that's not going to be your sales and marketing team, and that's not going to be your operational team, etc. That's where asset management comes in to looking at that side. So costs and income. That's they're there to optimize both, or optimize and minimize accordingly.
So this is going to be an interesting one, given how we started the conversation around, international students. But how do you think operators should be thinking differently about marketing to international audiences today?
Well, I think first of all, there's you have to understand the culture that you're actually trying to sell to. How do they like things presented to them? I think, us Brits, we're absolutely marvellous at going around the world and stamping, this is how we do it in Britain. And I think having been somebody who's grown up largely in Europe, I've always appreciated other cultures, even though they're just on my doorstep, let alone the ones that are further afield. So I think from my perspective, number one is understanding how that society works, what their expectations are. That's number one. I think the second element for me is, I guess, how do they do business? Now, I'm sure you're trying to point me in this direction, but certain people have been winding me up about this. I think the reliance of a lot of UK operators on using overseas agents is, I think, creating a rod for our own backs.
And Joss, just to interject, so for those people who are not familiar with PBSA, what is overseas agents?
So a lot of countries have agents that will essentially sell both courses and accommodation within those specific geographies, and therefore they will charge a fee to either a university or to a PBSA provider for providing that tenant to them. And it's increasingly happening as well with universities and sourcing the students to come to university in the first place. But it's very prevalent in PBSA in how a lot of operators source. In fact, there are certain operators out there who have very little sales and marketing of their own within their businesses, and they rely almost wholly on agents. And the agents have increasingly, particularly the ones in China, have tried to create sort of monopoly positions in the UK with a number of specific providers. And that's largely, of course, enhanced in the case of China by the fact it's very difficult to advertise directly in China for UK businesses. But obviously, spending the time and effort to develop that within your company is not necessarily something that's going to pay off immediately today will pay off in the longer term. And I think, there's some other people in the sector who've been quite vocal on this, particularly Dan Smith, in regards to it's probably better for you within your business in the long term and your long term interests to develop your own platforms, and WeChat programs to go into those markets. And I completely agree. People shouldn't be relying on agents. It's an easy way, but a lazy way of doing things. And if you're here as a long-term business, you need to address this. And I think culturally, the other aspect is you need to understand what people's price points are. And I think ultimately, yes, as I've said, alluded to earlier, a lot of people have chased after that luxury end of the Chinese market, and there seems to be a lot of people who are willing and prepared to pay those sorts of high prices, but the majority of the rest of the markets are very price sensitive, just as they are in the UK, just as the UK domestic market is. And so I think you need to approach, as I said at the start, each country and domain very differently. We've also seen, one of the things we've seen in recent years, prior to it being banned by the government, but we used to see large cohorts of Nigerian students in the UK. Nigerian students really like bringing their families over, and that's something that was banned under the last Conservative government, and then upheld by Starmer when he came to power. But fundamentally, if you actually go back and read the government's own recommendations, both under the Conservatives and under Labour, that amply demonstrated that the boost to the economy of having students and their dependents come to the UK was a huge boost to the Treasury. And actually, we've done ourselves out of the benefit of that income to the Treasury. There was a report that was done. I can't remember off the top of my head. I wrote a post about it some years ago. But essentially, it wasn't just the student that was benefiting by coming to our country, in terms of the fees they were paying. But it also often the dependents worked, and then there was a contribution to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And over the period of 10 years, they showed that it would be a loss to the UK of doing this. And you really have to ask yourself, time and time again, why, if this is clearly demonstrated to be the benefit of the UK, why are we saying no to it? And of course we're saying no to it because of the ever-growing love of some people in this country for Farage and keeping the foreigners out, inverted commas. But it's sadly deluded, because in the majority of instances, students coming to this country are coming to learn so that they can take back the expertise that they've gained here to their own countries, to either in business or medicine or the arts or whatever it is, to improve their own countries and cultures. So I think, we've spent too many years being a political football in this country. Students have spent too many years being a political football in this country. Full stop. I mean, it's got to the nth degree for me. But cultural sensitivities, I think, is a big theme. Both get more students in the long term.
Joss, bit of a change of tack. We know that a lot of investors at the moment are frustrated by the operators. Why do you think they're so frustrated? And what do you think needs to change?
Well, I think we've covered a little bit of this earlier. I think the element of asset management, I think, is a really key, sort of scenario. You probably hear more frustrations from investors, with their operators than I do, because mine are bloody happy, and so they should be in the results that we've given them over the last 4 or 5 years, or 10 years in the case of some of my investors. So look, I don't get too many complaints, but I do understand that others are not seeing the types of returns that we deliver, and I think often. I think people, when I talk about the fact that over the last 6, 4 or 3 years, depending on the portfolios that we operate, we've delivered NOI CAGRs over those periods of between 9 and 11%. And I don't think many people like it when I come out with that, because they're like, oh shit, what have we got? What have we done? What have our and their investors, sort of get a little bit annoyed. I mean, recently I had a classic where I made a bid on something, on an asset somewhere, and I think it was one of the best compliments I've ever been paid. The investor then rang the operator slash asset manager and said, what the hell's going on? He can see some value in this that you can't. We thought we optimised the value, but if he's bidding, he means he sniffs blood. That was probably one of the greatest compliments I've been paid in recent years. I need to disguise myself a bit better in the future, but it's difficult when you're 146 kg and as vocal as I am. But anyway, I think it's I've completely lost my train of thought now.
Well, I think what is interesting is obviously you're advising quite a few investors at the moment on strategies for this year and for next year and for the next 5 years. But what's your game plan right now? Where is value? Where should people be buying? And why do you think student at the moment is a good investment?
I think you've got. I think first of all you've got to follow exactly. I mean, I reiterate it, guys. Why aren't people listening to Unite? Unite are focusing on 20 cities in the UK. They are very clear on that, on what they're looking for, and I completely agree with them. I think they've got the right strategy.
And what are those cities, Joss? Any particular ones that you?
Primarily the Russell Group cities. It's the ones you can imagine. It's the If I asked you now, if you want me to write a list, the top 20, essentially it's the major cities that we have in this country. I mean, look, I think from my take at the moment, I think I go back to where we slightly started this conversation today. Is always remember where is the domestic market? What does the domestic market need? Years ago, when we first started in this industry, I was reminded of this the other day. We looked at this as we saw universities that had a lot of their own accommodation that wasn't fit for purpose anymore. There's a lot of universities that have still got that accommodation. And the reason why is because ultimately they have no debt on it. It produces an income. That income helps their bottom line. But and they can't afford to replace it, but then that means that it gets to a point where, yes, is it going out at a cheap price? Yes, it's going out at a cheap price, but ultimately there comes a time when really the lifespan of a building is the lifespan of a building, and you can't push it much further. And when you're charging students £9,500 in fees to go to university and blah blah blah, it gets to a point where the students going, it might be 70 quid a week, but I still don't want to live there. And there are assets that are getting to that sort of point now, which I probably thought would have been taken out of the market 15, 20 years ago. But they're still there. And I think we're getting to a point where we have to be realistic that there is no more lifespan on those, and that is also going to be driven by certain legislation, carbon, footprints, etc., and those sorts of elements that will kick in by 2030. So a lot of universities are going to have to think about that. So I go back to the original rationale of what we're trying to do here. We are trying to serve and support universities in delivering all the accommodation they require for their first years. That's number one. Number two is the second and third year scenario. In cities that have been heavily developed with student accommodation over the years, like Liverpool, which a lot of PBSA went into early, we've already seen throughout the years a decrease in the amount of students in HMOs and an increase in the amounts of PBSA, because there was more than enough PBSA, and therefore second and third years started living in PBSA. And that, in Liverpool, it's a very common tenant. Not, there's not the sort of thing that you see in loads of other cities where everyone wants to move out of the city centre and go to HMO, go and live in HMOs. That obviously still prevalent in Newcastle, which was one of the last cities to be developed with sufficient PBSA to house all of the first years, let alone start to tap into second and third years. And as a result, still everyone wants to go and live in Jesmond, in Newcastle. But in Liverpool, you have actually seen Liverpool is one of the few cities where the universities have combined to create one student accommodation office, and so they've kept a record of the data over the years, and you can see for yourself how HMOs have reduced and reduced and reduced literally over the last 15-20 years. But that's because sufficient PBSA was built. So going back to a comment you made earlier, build it and they will come, which a lot of people have thought for a long time. I'm not suggesting that anyone should go back to doing that, but what the point I am making is that where there is sufficient PBSA for second and third years to continue to live in it, they will come. They will come. And I think with one of the biggest things that people have underestimated now, currently, is the impact of the Renters' Rights Act. And I think there is a huge window of where the HMO market historically was able to operate and let to students, which was fundamentally with from that end of September period through to November. And most of, in a lot of cities, by December, the HMO market, or the majority of good properties in the HMO market, are gone. And I think under the Act, one of the big things that will change is that a lot of HMO owners will not be allowed to lease their properties before the start of January. And I think that is going to have a big impact on the market. Now, will it happen immediately? No. These things take time to shift, but I can see it within one university cohort changing dramatically. So I think over the next 2-3 years, we will see that fundamentally change and potentially have a hugely positive impact on the market of existing PBSA for second and third years coming in and staying there. I'm already seeing in somewhere like Newcastle students who lived with us for the first year and then moved out to terraced housing for the second year, coming back for the third year because they want to be in an environment which is safe, secure, and we have buildings specifically in the way that we built our major development in Newcastle. We built it so that there were 2 buildings which were very much for first years. A third potentially could be first years or second years, and then we built a block specifically for for postgraduates, quieter, more studios, smaller block, and then we built a third block for people who wanted to come back for that last year, so that you could start your career in 2 blocks within the student village, and then progress through. And we've even got little differences in spec in the buildings. So, your second and third year buildings have dishwashers in them.
Nice.
Not that some of them have ever been used. They're still the original packets. These are 5-6-year-old buildings. Some of the original packets are still open in some of them, but or still unopened rather. But you could literally follow your career through the university, but still feel like you're in the same environment. You have the same access to all the facilities we have on the site there, which is we've got a Tesco in there, a Subway. We've even got a doctor's surgery going in, and a big yoga studio, and as well as the usual gym and then our own amenities within our buildings. But it's that feeling of being able to feel like, all right, I have a first year, these are the 2 party buildings, and then, this is the quiet, reflective study. I'm terribly mature now in my third year, so I'm going to go into this one, or, I'm going to go into these 2 buildings in the second year with my mates, the mates I've made in my first year. So that sort of continuity of that community is what we tried to create there, and we're beginning to see it. We're beginning to see third years come back. Suddenly, living next to Geordie Mike, who's got a 3-year-old kid, and trying to party in that house is not a sensible idea, because Geordie Mike's coming around every night with his ready to thump you, if you don't keep the noise down after 9:30 p.m. And quite right, he should. So I think students often forget that when they go out into the, HMOs and the wider, they are living in the wider community, and they do have neighbours, who have lives, jobs, etc., etc. So being in the environment that we create for them may well feel sometimes forced and constrained or whatever, but ultimately it's there to really help support them and be able to enjoy it. Often I've stayed in my buildings over the years, and I've forgotten, I've got the wrong night, and so I've ended up being in Newcastle on a Wednesday night. And suddenly, these courtyard buildings, which we built, so that there's a single point of entry and everything's nice and safe and secure. You forget the downside at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. because they still sort of like, I'm staying in one of the show flat rooms, so I can still say that I sleep in my own buildings, etc. And then all of a sudden you realise, no, this noise isn't stopping. It's 10 o'clock now. Why aren't they going to club at 10? You don't realise that this cohort generation, they don't go to club till 1 a.m. And I'm like, so they're all having parties inside the block before they go out to the parties, because of course, going to have a beer in a pub's not done anymore. It's too expensive. And so they're all having parties in their flats before going out, and then they go out at 1 a.m. And then I'm like, you're not getting to sleep till 1:30, and then the next morning I can barely speak. But again, societal shift.
I highly doubt that, Joss.
But ultimately they are, it's they can do that in their environment. I'm the only one who's complaining at that point, and I'm not complaining because wouldn't dare complain given the fact that they're paying me to be there.
So the conclusion for investors is student accommodation, PBSA, is there to stay.
I think absolutely, but you have to focus on the right places. It's where it's the macro locations, it's the micro locations, it's where the demand is. I think back to your point earlier that you made. For too long, people have just thought, oh, you can build anywhere. Oh, I'll build in Chester and Chichester and Colchester and Cheltenham and lots of other but don't get me wrong, I think there's probably demand in all of those places. But if you're an institutional investor, you really need to think very carefully about where you need to be. One of the first lessons that was taught me in property is when you go into an asset, work out where your exit is. And I've always retained that tenet ever since. It's who's my exit going to be? How is it going to be? Do I have to explain to a USP house or a Singaporean investor where Chelmsford is and why we should invest in Chelmsford? Yeah, you're going to. No, don't bother. Mm. So that rules it out for me. Now, I might be an utter snob, and I'm quite happy to take that accusation, etc. And I've got nothing against Chelmsford personally, but for me, that is, do I have to explain to an international investor what I'm doing with a building there? If I do have to do that, then it's not for me.
And swiftly before we move on, I think the question that a lot of people are thinking about at the moment is, do we buy first or second generation assets to refurb? Or do we buy the best quality stuff and wait for the market to improve? What's your view?
Well, first of all, how many generations of PBSA do you think there are? Because in my book, there's about 5.
I would say 4, but I mean, you've been in the industry longer than me.
I think you've got you've got a generation of stock that sort of is pre-2002. You've got a stock after 2002. I mean, look, I did this a while back. Most people call generation stock basically the stock before 2009. I think that's general sort of consensus of things. There is not a lot of stock before 2009. When you actually look at the numbers, I remember back in 2002, I think it was 2002, Unite had just listed on AIM. Nick Porter had just been made CEO. Nick was giving I think it was a symposium, an update to shareholders in the city. and Nick, I think, accidentally misspoke. And basically, what he meant to say was, we will build 4,000 beds over the next 3 years. And I think what was misinterpreted in the room was, we will build 4,000 beds each year for the next 3 years. So ultimately, when Unite hadn't built 4,000 beds over the next 3 years, the market absolutely went apeshit. Well, they hadn't even achieved that, let alone the 12,000 beds they'd misinterpreted. And of course, the Unite share price took an absolute dump in about 2003 on the back of that. So let me reiterate that. Over 3 years, between 2002 and 2000, let's call it 2005, 2006, Unite didn't manage. They did shortly the year after, but it took them about 4 years instead of 3 to build 4,000 beds. And they were the biggest builder of beds at the time. Don't get me wrong, Watkins Jones were about in those early days. They were probably doing some things. And there are probably a few others. But, I keep saying, how many beds do you think were built between, year X and 2009? And it's considerably less than 100,000 beds. Considerably less. I think I did some maths on it a while back. I can't quite remember the exact figure, but I reckoned it was well under 60,000 beds. And then you've got some beds that are probably pretty dodgy in that. And actually, majority of those beds, by the way, are still owned by Unite. So this first generation stuff, what's everyone talking about? So that's kind of where I get to. That was a long-winded way of getting to my point. There is some, sort of second generation. I consider second generation also before 2009. But, actually a lot of it was built between 2009 and 2012. And if you think about what you're calling the second generation, a lot of that stuff is basically, oh shit, we're in the middle of a recession. I've got an empty office building. What the hell do I do with it? Yeah. And a lot of it was built by, I'm thinking of a polite word, Muppets, who didn't really know what they were doing. The sort of people who went, oh, no, I've built offices and I've built warehouses and I've built these things before. I can easily convert to student accommodation. So you've got a lot of stock, and the permitted development rights immediately post that as well brought that was a few years later. But you ended up with a whole load of people who have probably built some of the most botched rubbish you've ever come across in your life, just by making simple mistakes that most of us learned years ago. I mean, probably before the turn of the millennium. So there's a lot of stock that people need to be very wary of in that second generation of stock, as you're calling it, from sort of 2009 through to 2015, 16. And I just think there's a lot of developers who didn't have a clue what they were doing during that period. And so, do I think there's an opportunity there? Of course I do. I mean, I think when the sort of stock comes to the market, absolutely. And as we started, I think we were talking about it earlier before we started the podcast, but there's some brilliant stuff that was built by the likes of Victoria Hall back in the day, and that was the Fling Group with John Nesbitt, and they were some of the earliest developers in the sector. 20 years later, their buildings are still looking good. They're courtyard developments. They're 4 or 5 stories, probably not with lifts in them. So, you don't have that, some of them don't have the hassle of that sort of element. It's, students, you can walk up the stairs. Yeah, you can. I can still fit in the showers in those, buildings, etc. Then, they were not, a lot of them they're not pods like they are today. The shower bit is a pod, but obviously the rest of the bathroom is tiled. They're good sizes. So ultimately, is there opportunity there? Absolutely. It's the sort of stock I'm more than happy to buy. But you have to then address the refurbishment programs that are required on them. And I think what we've seen with some of the investors that have gone in to buy that first generation stock is they've become so obsessed about the opportunity to redevelop it. They have overspec'd the refurbishment of these properties to an extent that you will not, they will ultimately not see a return on their equity investment. And I think you need to be very careful about the price points. I'm often criticised for using the term putting lipstick on a pig, but ultimately I like pigs. They produce bacon, sausages, pork chops, all the things I like.
Lots of options.
So I love pigs. So it's not being rude in my book, but that it's a sensible, solid animal. But you don't have to pay for. It's not a fillet steak or a wagyu or Kobe or whatever you like. It's just a simple animal, sensibly priced. Leave it that way. Just make it look better than it is.
I
Put a
get
little bow.
you.
Put a little bow on it.
I get you, because I think some of the new stuff is obviously new and you can design it as such from scratch, whereas the older stuff is limited, and actually the reason why you're buying it is to appeal to the domestic market and the depth of the market.
Exactly, and at an affordable price point. So don't try and turn it into something it's not and can never be. And I've seen this done. Unite sold 6 portfolios over the years, at least in the more recent years. And I've seen some people who get it right and some people who've got it wrong. And I think you just need to be very careful about where your price point ends up, and that's the key mission to it. And really think about who is your target market, for that product once complete. So I think there's and I think some of these guys have built, 20 years ago, don't forget, also most of the things that we built were brick built. So you don't have the cladding issues that, are now occurring. We've remediated over the last 3 years, at least 4 buildings, 3 buildings, with cladding issues or compartmentation issues, etc., etc. In fact, we've taken one building that was completely shut down, uninhabitable, and completely remediated that. I mean, that ended up having so much wrong with it. It was unbelievable. But I think you need to go in with your eyes wide open, and you need to do it with somebody who knows what they're doing, because we've learned a lot from undertaking the fire compartmentation and remediation that we've undertaken over these buildings over the last few years. And we've done it, by the way, most of it with students in situ. So a lot of people shut down their buildings and turf out the tenants. Whereas, if I can still make money while I'm remediating a building, I will always do that. Now, don't get me wrong. We managed to let a building, St James, in Glasgow this year, 25-26. We're 100% let in the building. Okay, it's had scaffolding on it since April last year. I'm gonna. For once, I'm going to big up my sales and marketing team. They managed to sell a building covered in scaffolding, all right, relatively elegant scaffolding, but they managed to sell a building 100% in a supposedly difficult city last year, with scaffolding on the sides of the building. And don't get me wrong, we dropped an income because our tenants weren't going to pay full price, but we probably dropped, I think, 20% of our income on the previous year. So still quite a substantial hit for us to take. But on the other hand, to get a building fully let, and we managed the job throughout the year and reclad the building. This is Glasgow, by the way. The Building Safety Act does not apply to Glasgow. But as far as I'm concerned, it goes back to something I mentioned earlier, which is I like to be able to sleep in my bed with a good conscience. And fortunately, so do my investors. And as a result, we undertook work where we weren't necessarily obligated to undertake the work, but we all wanted to do it because we thought it was the best thing to do and the right thing to do. So I think there are opportunities. There are a lot of opportunities, but you need to go in there with your eyes wide open and know what you're doing.
So I know we could sit here for hours putting the real estate market to rights, but if you could reinvent one thing about the real estate sector, what would that be?
One thing about the real estate sector as a whole.
Whatever you decide, Joss.
Sorry, I'm going to have to be boring and make it specifically about PBSA. I think if we could go back to the beginning and start again, I think we should have just made things, particularly in PBSA, simpler. We should have not ever got into this arms race on amenities. I think we should have just dialed it back. I think, and the reason why I'm annoyed about it is because, in retrospect, and what we alluded to in Europe earlier, it's, you look around Europe and you look what's being done there, and you go, yeah, we didn't need to get to where we've got to here. And I just think it's a simple mistake. And it's one I regret, probably because, more than anything, the cost of going to university, the cost of accommodation, is what is now, we're now in a situation, and that's putting people off potentially going to tertiary education. And I hate the fact it's doing that. I think, for me, the more educated people we have in this country, the better this country will be. And so ultimately, yeah, I'm, it sounds whimsical, but if we hadn't done what we'd done, would more people be going to Bristol University now? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a complete moron. I also know that if you want a good education and an affordable one, and and you want affordable accommodation, there are plenty of good universities you can go to. You can go to Coventry and go to Warwick or Coventry University. You can go to Sheffield and get a bed there for £99 a week for 40 weeks a year. And you can go to Sheffield Hallam or Sheffield University, Russell Group universities. You can probably get a bed I suspect, in Nottingham for £90 a week these days as well.
Don't, Joss.
No, well, of course you can. I mean, the amount of poorly located PBSA that's been built there and been released into the market.
But
all
Liverpool's
at
a good example of that. I mean, obviously, we just did a report with Student Crowd, and the average price per bed in Liverpool is £150 a week. So there's a lot of reason why people want to be attracted to that marketplace.
Well, exactly, but I'm talking about I think Liverpool's undervalued at £150.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
A week. Yeah,
that's what I mean.
Don't get me wrong. I think there's way to go in Liverpool, but I think you've got markets like Nottingham, where you really can go and get a bed for £95 a week. I think these are the places that students should be focusing on going. I actually don't believe in the whole affordability argument at all, because essentially, let's not beat around the bush. Most Russell Group universities have 30 to 30, well, almost to 40% of their cohort that are from private schools. Another 15 to 20% of their cohort that are from overseas. So pretty much every single Russell Group university is underpinned by at least 50% of their population who can well afford to go to university. I mean, if you've got a kid going through private school right now, particularly in one of the UK's boarding schools, I mean, sending your kid to university is a light relief by comparison. It's probably somewhere like a tenth of the cost. So ultimately, I think people need to get real about things, but ultimately I think there's a solution out there for everyone today. But yeah, changing in the real estate market. Wish we'd never got into the arms race on PBSA.
There we are. Thank you so much, Joss, for joining us. Absolutely loved the conversation. So insightful, and lots of interesting and unique takes that I think everyone's going to be very fascinated with.
My pleasure. Great fun to do it.